Magic the Gathering is an expensive and complicated game to learn how to play, and to that end, Wizards of the Coast release a product roughly every year that is currently called the Starter Kit. I think it used to be called Duel Decks, and they've probably changed the name about half a dozen times in the last 5 years, because that's what they do. But specifically, at the start of September this year, they released this one, Starter Kit 2023. Now, in the UK at least, this retails for about £16, I think, from where I've looked on the internet. In the US, it's somewhere between $16 and $20. Obviously, your mileage may vary. Check your local game stores, check Amazon, whatever. I'm sure some places will have it cheaper than others because Wizards don't do retail prices. So the role of this product is generally for either new players to pick up themselves to learn how to play the game, or for, say, an experienced player to buy to play with a friend they want to get into it, which means it should feature 2 decks, and those 2 decks should be fairly balanced to play against each other with. And as it says on the back here, it also contains the codes to unlock them in Magic Arena, and all of the cards should be standard legal as well. Obviously, if you're buying this in the future and standard has rotated, it's possible they aren't. Now, the first thing I've noticed about this one compared to last year's, which I didn't make a review on, but I have bought in the past, as you can see from this, last year's came with a lot more plastic in the packaging, so I am glad they've gone to a more cardboard approach. I believe the decks themselves are still sealed, but there's not that hard plastic shell that there was last year, which is positive. We like to see that. So let's get it open, shall we? I'm sorry if there is a more obvious way to open this that I just missed, but that was not the most pleasant experience in the world. Okay, so we'll put this aside. And then we've got a few things here. So firstly, we've got the quote-unquote deck boxes. They do fit the cards, just as long as you never sleeve them, because the second you do, they are too big to fit. It also features a play guide, which is nice to see. I'm glad they don't just say, well, go on Arena and play the tutorial. That'll teach you how to play. I'm glad there is a guide for if you are just playing in paper. So I'm assuming all that's in this is the cards themselves. And yeah, there is plastic around these, but, you know, honestly, that's probably a good thing. You don't want them tampered with if there are any cards of value, which I doubt there are because it's a starter kit. So I'll put this packaging and this deck to the side for now. We'll look at the other one first. Here I am trying to clunkily unwrap it, and it's got a little tab that I could have just used the entire time. So I'm going to, off camera, remove the card from the back. This card from the back is contains the code for you to unlock all of the cards on Arena. I'm expecting there to be another one of these on the back of the other deck, and each of those codes unlocks everything on Arena, so both decks, which means that if you buy this to play with a friend, you can both unlock everything on your own Arena accounts. So this is the face card Tyrant of Care Ridges in this deck. I believe this will be the only foil card you get in each of these decks, the face card. As you can see from the card behind, this is an Is It deck, so it's blue and red. This deck features 11 mountains, featuring these 2 arts from Wilds of Eldraine, as well as 11 islands featuring these 2 arts from Wilds of Eldraine, which means we're already at 22 lands, and they've included a full playset of Swiftwater Cliffs, which, if you don't know, enters the battlefield tapped, and you gain 1 life when it does, and it can tap for blue or red, which means we've got 26 lands in this deck, which is quite a lot. However, I do think there is some benefit for a new player to not end up mana screwed in, you know, some of their first games. Plus, if you would like to, you know, upgrade this and make this the basis of your standard deck, that's 4 obvious cuts immediately, maybe even 6, as this does seem to be a fairly aggro deck from reading the other cards as I was sorting them. I'll show you what I mean, starting with the dragon creatures. Shivan Branch Burner, which is 7 mana, but because it has Convoke, you can pay by tapping your other creatures as flying and can attack immediately with haste. There is only one of these, so I expect they think you should be playing this as a finisher, basically. Similar to Shivan Devastator, which for X and red also has flying and haste and enters with X +1/+1 counters. So it's a big mana sink. So maybe that's one of those uses for all of those lands you'll have. This is the face card of the deck. Again, Tyrant of Care Ridges. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target, including your opponent's face. And for a red, you can give it +1 until end of turn. It does, however, cost 6 mana. So you are effectively only playing this as a game winner. So when you're already in the position that you've got them down low enough and you've got enough lands in play that you can play this and use both the 4 damage and maybe, if you need it, wait the extra turn and attack face with it. And then Ragefire Hellkite, you can sacrifice another creature when it attacks and it gains double strike, so it hits twice which in this case would be 10 damage to whatever it hits. However, again, it's another card that costs 6 mana, which for a fairly aggro deck is quite a lot. Dragon Whelp is a card that I have seen see play recently in Standard. It's 4 mana, including 2 red, flying, and you can buff it using extra red mana. However, if you've done that 4 or more times in a turn, it gets sacrificed. That's one of the cards that we have multiple copies of, in this case 3. And we also have the only blue dragon in this deck, Archive Dragon, which again is another 6 mana card. It has flying and ward 2, and when it enters the battlefield you can scry 2, which means look at the top 2 cards of your library and choose whether to put them on the bottom or keep them at the top. For non-dragon creatures, we have Godric Cloaked Reveler, which isn't a dragon itself. However, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, it becomes a dragon, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 1 red mana and buff all of your other dragons, really adding to that dragon tribal theme. Also, if you're a new player, this is a legendary creature, so you could consider building a commander deck around it, although of course would be mono red, as there are no other colours on it. Another card you could consider doing that with is this one, Zarkan Solarflame. 1 blue red, dragon spells cost 1 less to cast, and whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, it can become a copy of that dragon until end of turn. Aether Channel is a nice card which can give you a few choices. You can create a token to block with, you can return a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, so if your opponent plays a big threat, you can just make them do it again the next turn, or you can draw a card if you're in need of one. Ingenious Prodigy is another card that enters with X +1/+1 counters on, so it's another mana sink, really. However, you can quite usefully remove those +1/+1 counters once in each of your turns at the start of them, and draw a card. Kolaghan Warmonger, again on that dragon tribal synergy here. It has haste as well, so it's a fairly useful card in its own right for just attacking, although a little bit expensive for that. You can look at the top 6 cards of your library, you may reveal a dragon card from among them and put it into your hand. So if you're out of options, this is always a good one to play because it works on its own and gives you more options for the future. And the deck has 3 of those. It also has Rock Hunter, a card we would consider French vanilla, as in it has no abilities except a single keyword, in this case reach, so it can block creatures with flying. 2 mana for a 1/3. This deck has 2 of them. I'm telling you now, that would be on my cut list, most likely, if I was upgrading this deck. And we have a full playset of Stormkeld Prowler. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you can give this creature 2 +1/+1 counters, which for only 2 mana itself is fairly good. It's not a card that does nothing. It can already block and whatever else. And you do, to be fair, have quite a lot of those cards in this deck. It's probably not a generally useful card, but in a deck like this, which has a lot of high mana value creatures, it suddenly has a lot more utility. We also have a Dragonwing Glider, which has Famiridin, which is an ability that basically means that it effectively is a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you can also just then pay the extra mana and equip it to a different creature if you'd like. However, that equip cost is 5 mana, so you're probably not going to do that very often. So effectively, this is 5 mana for a 2/2 red rebel creature, which has +2/+2 flying and haste. And for enchantments, we have Stasis Field, which is just an aura from March of the Machines. Enchanted creature has base power and toughness 0/2, has defender, and loses all other abilities. So not one you'd play on your own creatures, one you'd play on your opponent's creatures. It means they can't attack, and they have no attack, so they can't damage your creatures if they block with them. And finally, instants and sorceries, or should I say just instants, because there are no sorceries in this deck whatsoever, which is a little bit backwards from how a lot of people choose to teach new players. They will kind of ignore instants for a while or treat them all as sorceries, because there are a lot of complexities around the stack and whatever that are necessary to learn the basics of the game that you can introduce later. It has 3 copies of Lightning Strike, which for 2 mana deals 3 to any target. It's just a straight up worse Lightning Bolt, but it is legal in Standard at the moment, which Lightning Bolt isn't. Also has Witchstalker Frenzy, which is a card from Worlds of Eldraine, or at least was reprinted in Worlds. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn and deals 5 damage to target creature. Now, the interesting thing about that is it's quite useful in Commander, because you don't actually have to be the one that's attacking with the creatures. Since it's available at instant speed, you can wait for one of your opponents to attack a different one of your opponents and take out a creature when that happens. Even if they attack with only 3 creatures, it suddenly becomes a 1 mana card. And finally, we have 2 copies of Quick Study, which for 3 mana in blue, you can draw 2 cards at instant speed. Nothing else, no scrying, no downsize, no discards. It's literally just draw 2 cards. And I bought one of these recently for my Commander deck, and I really wish I hadn't, knowing I now have 2. And on to the second deck. Now, I'll admit it after I've opened it, crinkling plastic noises. Now, I have been building a lot of decks recently that are red, blue, and green. So I don't know necessarily that much about what white has going on in standard at the moment. But hopefully it should be fairly obvious what this deck strategy is, and we'll see as we go along. In this deck, the basic land count is slightly different. We actually have 12 forests. I'll just show you those arts real quick. Once again from Wilds of Eldraine, it's these two. And only 10 plains, because it is the same number, just a slightly different ratio. And that's these two. Wilds of Eldraine. I do like the Wilds of Eldraine lands, the basics. I don't think anyone would be annoyed playing with these kind of anywhere, really. And of course, alongside that, we have Blossoming Sands, the equivalent of the land from the other deck. Enters the battlefield tapped, you gain 1 life, except it taps for green and white, obviously. And it is a full play set of those again. Less of a tribal deck, I think, this one. There are quite a lot of human cards. It doesn't seem like the synergies are necessarily focused around that. There's also a lot of warriors and soldiers. I think that just happens to be what got printed in white. For example, Siege Veteran creates a 1/1 colorless soldier token when another soldier you control that isn't a token dies, and put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control at the start of every single one of your combats. We have 2 copies of Recruitment Officer, a card which has devastated me on Arena in the past. 1 mana, 2/1 to start with is already pretty good. It's a guaranteed turn 1 play. And you can look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them and put it into your hand. And you can put the rest on the bottom, which lets you make sure you can always have the right answer later in the game. Samite Herbalist, whenever it becomes tapped, you gain 1 life and scry 1, which is a fairly good utility. We'll see as we go through if there's any synergies to make it tapped without having to attack, but even if it only triggers when you attack, that's still pretty good. Life gain is a pretty common theme in white, so for 3 mana Mesa Cavalier, flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. We have 3 copies of that, and 2 copies of Sigaled Sentinel, which has backup 1. Which means that when it enters the battlefield, you can give a creature you control +1/+1. It doesn't actually have to be a creature you control. It could be an enemy creature, and if that's a creature other than this card, so if you play this card and it's the only creature you have, obviously this will be the one that gets buffed. But if you have another creature in play, that creature also gains Vigilance. The face card of this deck is Boonbringer Valkyrie. For 3 white, it also has backup 1. So that works the same way, except that it's for flying, first strike, and lifelink, and is a 4/4, arguably more playable than the face card of the other deck. More of those +1/+1 counter synergies with Simeon's Simulacrum, 3 mana artifact creature ape. When it enters the battlefield, you can put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and you can unearth it from the graveyard for paying the same mana. It will just be exiled at the end of that turn. The 2 green, a card I suspect you may have trouble casting. There are more forests than plains in this deck, as we saw earlier, but still, that's 3 green pips in a 2-color deck. That's going to be fairly tricky. But if you do manage it, whenever you cast a creature spell, you can choose to destroy an artifact or enchantment, look at the top 5 cards of your library, and put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, or gain 4 life. A lot of one-off cards in this deck. We've got 3 more, actually. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Dusk Legion Duelist, draw a card, and it only triggers once per turn for 2 mana. It also has Vigilance, so it can attack and it won't be tapped, which means that you can block with it as well. Ancient Imperiosaur, which is 7 mana. Thankfully you are in green, so there are some abilities in this deck which let you add extra lands into play. Still, I'm not sure how often you are playing this. Without using the Convoke cost. It has Trample and Ward 2, and it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each creature that convoked it. So in fact, you are benefiting from using Convoke to pay it then. But yeah, if you ever pay 7 mana for this, you've screwed up. Quirion Beast Stealer. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you get a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, you can distribute X +1/+1 counters among target creatures you control, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters already on it. Finally, the cards that we have multiple copies of, in this case, 2 Fairground Trumpeters. For 3 mana at the beginning of each end step, if a +1/+1 counter was put on a permanent under your control, this also gets a +1/+1 counter. You can see this deck's theme coming out quite quickly now. Magnagoth Sentry, once again one of these French vanilla creatures, is 4 mana 4/4 with reach. Chomping Cavu, 4 mana, also has backup 1, and the ability that it would give the other creature is it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. 2 copies of those. and it is a 3/3 by default. And finally, for creatures, we have 2 copies of Iridescent Blade Master, which is 2 mana for a 2/2, and for 4 additional mana, you can give it +2/+2. Not great, not bad, works fine in a starter deck, especially if you're only ever playing the other deck, I think. Certainly not exactly a meta card, but you know, there's only so much you can do. We have Giant Growth for 1 mana, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. It's at instant speed. Only one of those. Although we also have Titanic Growth, another card I bought recently that I am now regretting having spent that money on, because it's 2 mana instant, target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. So not quite the same card, but very close in effect. We have Broken Wings, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying for 3 mana. Very useful for controlling the game. We have 2 copies of those. And the only sorcery in the entire starter kit, unless I'm an idiot and I've misread some of these, for 2 green and green, so 4 mana in total. You can distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among up to 4 target creatures you control. They also gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. That's called Storm the Seed Core. It's interesting that out of presumably 120, I actually haven't counted these cards, these are the only 2 sorceries. And last we have enchantments. In the Trenches, 1 white, creatures you control get +1/+1. And for 6 mana, you can exile target non-land permanent you don't control under it effectively. So unless they have enchantment removal, it's gone forever. That's really expensive, so I'm not sure how often you're actually casting that. I suspect the creatures you control get +1/+1 is the main reason you would like this. Interestingly, it's a mythic rare, which I think isn't true, given it's in a £16 starter kit. And cooped up, we have 3 copies of this. It's an enchantment aura. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, so once again, it's one you're going to be using on your enemy's creatures rather than your own. And for an additional 3, you can also exile it, which is a good utility card for sure. At least at this power level. I'm not sure I can guarantee that this would see play in, I don't know, Modern or whatever. Even Pauper these days. So yes, that's everything you get in the 2023 Magic the Gathering starter kit. I will leave some footage in now of me using one of these codes on Arena and showing what I get from all of that. I don't know yet. I'm assuming it's exactly the same as last year, and you basically just get these cards and maybe a few bonuses. Now, this does bring me to the question, should you buy this? And while, yes, this is a good product that I am very glad Wizards made, the problem is that Starter Kit 2022 still exists and is usually half the price. It's £8 for 2 decks rather than 16, usually about $10 in the States. And I don't think the value you get from these 2 decks rather than those 2 decks is worth double the money. If you're watching this next year and Starter Kit 2024 has come out and these are now £8, then absolutely go ahead and buy these 2. But frankly, it would just be wrong of me to suggest that you should go out and buy these 2 from the outside here when these 2 are perfectly serviceable. If you want to learn how to play the game, these do the exact same job. And there has been no rotation this year, so both of these are still standard legal as well. They may not be the newest cards, but I mean, they're only a year old. Hopefully this has been useful for you. Thank you all so very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you have any thoughts about this kind of style of video, I guess, and I'll see you next time.